We're getting a new fence. One of the few problems we had with Harvey doesn't compare at all to a lot of people around us. Okay, so again, English common law, women had almost no rights. And I'm talking about very familiar areas of the United States, all the way up and down the East Coast during the British colonial period. Um, and the women kind of disappeared into when she got married. Legally speaking, women basically disappeared in British North America. Very, very different in Spanish Texas. Beginning really in the 1200s in Spain, of course, women were given significant property rights. Now, part of this is because the Spanish from the 700s all the way to the 1400s were at constant war with the Muslims who had come up and conquered the Iberian Peninsula. So what you had in what's now Spain, it was a bunch of different duchies and kingdoms, but now it's the nation of Spain. Constant war, husbands were getting killed all the time. It was incredibly dangerous. And so partially why the Spanish king and queens offered women these property rights, part of it was out of the goodness of their heart, but part of it was just very practical because women were becoming widowed so frequently. And so part of it was an adjustment to a society that was at war for centuries. The Catholic Spain versus the Muslims who had come up from North Africa. So this tradition of offering women property rights, even married women, cross the Atlantic into colonial Mexico and into Spanish Texas. So in Spanish Texas, there, as you know, there was a real shortage of women. There was a shortage of people in general, but certainly a shortage of women. We've talked about this a bunch. It's too remote. It's too dangerous. There were disease. There were constant Indian attacks. You really only came up to San Antonio unless you had no other cards to play, unless your life, this was your only choice. Folks that had choices did not come to San Antonio, and if they came as business or government, they serving government and maybe officer in the military. And most of those folks left as soon as they could. So there's an incentive on the part of authorities in Mexico City, which ruled Spanish Texas and Madrid, to offer women, to keep the kind of rights that women had in Spain, to keep them for women in Spanish Texas, and to a certain extent even expand them. The government agreed to provide free land for women who came into San Antonio or Spanish Texas. They paid expenses, and they would provide special privileges. And the other thing that was very, very important is that women retained their property after they were married. This was not true in British North America. Once a woman married in, say, Boston, all her property became her husband's property. She disappeared legally into the marriage. Not true in Spanish Texas. So based on the tradition that had come over from Spain, women were given a status in Spanish Texas that was nearly equal to that of men. Most importantly, women in Spanish Texas could hold property under their own name. A woman could sell any separate property that she owned before the marriage. So if a woman came into a marriage owning property, it was still her property. It did not automatically become her husband's property, as was the case in British North America. Property that was purchased or inherited during the marriage belonged to both spouses, not just to the man. You did not, again, have this in British North America. Before a woman sold any property that she owned or that she co-owned with her husband, she had to give consent before any of this property was sold. And if she, after a woman got married, and if she happened to have property and she wanted to sell a big chunk of her property, the authorities would come and talk to her and make sure that she was being coerced by her husband into selling the property. So Spanish authorities actually they were proactive in protecting the property rights of women. Now, for kids in 2017, or not everybody in the class is a kid, this may seem just normal, but I want to point out how extraordinary this was given the context. Women in Spanish Texas had as, as many rights or more rights, let me put it like that, especially when it came to property, than almost any other group of women, not only in North America, but in the world, because of these traditions that had come from Spain. And so this is why the story of this woman owning her ranch, what she was able to inherit it, which would have been much more difficult under British law. Under Spanish law, no one even questioned her inheritance. It became her property, and then she could do with it what she wanted. So that, I think, to me, that is really the most surprising thing about Spanish Texas. I think we tend to think about Spanish in really the way I'm teaching it. It's a failure. It's That's a little bit of an exaggeration. It's probably my fault. The Spanish never populated this region, but as I said in class on Monday, the Spanish left a permanent mark on this region. Spanish language, Roman Catholic Church, cattle ranching, horse ranching, the vaqueros. That begins in the Spanish period. The rodeo, that's begins in the Spanish period. Landmarks natural landmarks often have Spanish names. So we really, today, we still walk in the legacy of Spain. We see it almost every day. Look at the street signs if you drive down Days of Ala, for instance. So the Spanish legacy is still with us. But really, ironically, the Spanish legacy, although the Comanches were much more powerful than the Spanish, much more powerful, and this is one of the things hopefully I've gotten across in the course, the Comanche have left almost no legacy on Texas. Partly because they had no legal system, they had no religious system. They did have a religious system, but wasn't obviously widely adopted outside the Comanche people. They had so there was no rule of law. They were not literate, and so the Spanish, although they were much weaker in Texas than the Comanche, have left a legacy that's with us until this very day. And ironically, the Comanche were stronger, the Spanish were weaker. So although the Spanish were weaker, there's still a very powerful Spanish legacy. And there's almost no Comanche legacy. The Comanche, as we'll talk about over the course of this semester, were kicked out of Texas by the 1880s, and most Comanche now, the descendants of the Texas Comanche now live in Oklahoma.